Thank you very much, and thank you to everyone for the warm welcome and just inviting me to talk to you today. Very excited to share the presentation today on building a CEFR test. And yeah, great to see you all on screen. I have many happy memories of spending time in Indonesia. As a student, I traveled a lot through Indonesia and recently have been visiting for both work and pleasure. So it's great to see you all. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so I hope you can all see that. So today we're going to be talking about 5 key steps to building a world-class CEFR test. And before we jump in, just a little bit about myself. So as mentioned, I'm the Senior Assessment Manager at British Council English Score. I've been working in assessment for around the last 10 years or so, previously working on a mix of general proficiency English assessments at Pearson, mainly computer-delivered assessments, so very much focused on how do we take paper-based assessments and how do we put them online and ensure that they work in that computer-based environment. Prior to working in Pearson, I was based in the Philippines, working on a range of different workplace assessments, primarily for call centers and contact centers used by multinational companies, working in places like the Philippines, but also India and China as companies start to grow there and start to establish customer service teams in those countries. Prior to that, I have been a teacher. I've worked in a range of different countries or continents, including Africa, the Middle East, and Europe, and Asia, working in a range of different contexts, from sort of very much beginner students teaching English learners to read and write, up to really advanced level students, business people delivering presentations around the world. But today I wanted to talk to you about how we are using the CEFR, how we are taking our English score mobile test and aligning that to the CEFR, and what are the steps that you need to follow if you want to align to the CEFR, and what are the benefits of doing that. So I'm going to be talking about sort of 3 key areas. As one is just a brief introduction to the CEFR. Secondly, why you would want to use the CEFR, what benefits does it bring? And lastly, these 5 key steps that anyone can follow to align the assessment that you're building or that you have to the CEFR. And then lastly, as mentioned, we'll have some time for question and answers at the end. And it'll be great to hear your questions. So if we start by talking about the CEFR, what does it involve? So the CEFR is the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. And essentially it describes language ability, language proficiency. It's used around the world as a global standard for talking about language proficiency. There's a huge amount of documentation around it. It was set up by the Council of Europe several years ago, and it can be used not just for English, but for any language. But essentially it just describes what does language look like at different levels. It talks about a whole range of different language activities, including production, so that would be speaking and writing, reception, such as reading and listening, interaction, so back and forth, which might be written or spoken. So at the moment, I'm more focused on spoken production, but once we get into the Q&A, that will be more of an interaction, a back and forth. And mediation. Mediation is a relatively new term in the CEFR, and essentially this means things like interpretation or translation, or taking one text and converting that for someone else. So it's working between different texts, either spoken or written, and enabling communication in that way. It covers a range of different domains. So we have the personal domain, which is the very familiar, sort of about your family, about your friends, about your job. We have the public, which, as the name suggests, is those more public areas, such as in shops, on transport, dealing with public institutions like libraries, governments. We have the occupational domain, which is very much workplace. And lastly, we have education, which is your more academic language that's commonly seen in tests like IELTS, for example. It uses this system of levels, and you may well be familiar with these levels of A1 up to C2. There are 6 standard levels, and the CEFR started with these 6 levels, so moving from A1 to A2, B1 to B2, C1 to C2, with C2 the most advanced, and equate that to sort of proficient, and A1 would be a beginner learner of English. Since these initial 6 levels, additional levels have been added. So you may have heard of pre-A1, which are the very, very early stages of learning a language. And there are also plus levels. So you see A2 plus, B1 plus, and B2 plus. So depending how you look at it, there are sort of 6, 7, or possibly 10 levels. But it started out as these 6 levels, and these are the most commonly known ones. So what does the CEFR look like? How is it useful? I think one thing is useful to keep in mind is that we have these levels, these 6 levels of A1 to C2. And then we have these terms: beginner, elementary, intermediate, upper intermediate, advanced, and proficiency. These are sort of commonly what we use as teachers, as assessors when we're talking about levels of language learner. These are not exact labels. So for example, A2 covers both elementary and also parts of pre-intermediate, and similarly B2 would cover upper intermediate and possibly advanced as well. But this is just a good thing to have in the back of your mind if you like, to give you an idea of what do these different levels of A1, A2, etc. mean in terms of course books, or in terms of how we assign students to a class when they start learning the language. The CEFR then is made up of a set of descriptors. And there are a range of different descriptors. All of these are available on their website. You can access these. There's a huge amount of documentation, as I say. But to give you a sense of what it looks like, I have an example of an A1 descriptor. I'll just give you a few seconds to have a look at that. But you can see this is very much kind of a beginner, a description of a beginner learner in any language, not just English. So they can understand and use familiar everyday expressions that might be introductions, saying about where they're from and what they do. They can ask and answer questions about where they live, people they know, the things they have. Again, very much at that beginner level of learning a language. And they can interact with people as long as they talk slowly and clearly. And any one of us who has learned a language ourselves will recognize how important that is when we are talking to people, that they are slow, they make things clear for us. If we look at the other extreme, so if we look at a C2 descriptor, again, you can see the difference. You can see that how that descriptor has changed as you move through these different levels. So a C2 can understand with ease virtually everything heard or read. They can express themselves spontaneously, so without thinking, without planning, very fluently and precisely. Precisely is I really like this term. I think that means you can choose exactly the right word. You have a whole range of vocab, and you can choose exactly the right word to say exactly what you want to say. And I think the last one as well is really important: more complex situations. So you're moving from those very routine, familiar conversations about where you live and who you know and what you have, to far more complex situations, such as in work or in academia. So as I say, the CEFR is made up of a huge number of descriptors covering a whole range of different communication skills. And that is essentially what the CEFR is, and that's how it's used. For the rest of the presentation, I'm going to be talking about why we should use these descriptors and how we can actually use them in assessment. So why align to the CEFR? What value, what benefit does it bring to us? Essentially, we've got these 3 sort of areas of any learning, right? We have curriculum, so there's the materials, the content that we want to teach. We have delivery, and that could be involved in things around teacher training. It could be the materials that we're actually using, or it could be the learning environment. It could be the classroom. And then we have assessment, and that assessment could be formative, as in it's giving us feedback and diagnostic feedback and helping us to understand our strengths and weaknesses, or it could be summative. It could be making a decision that yes, you have passed or failed a course, or yes, you have achieved this grade in this class. So we have these three aspects of learning. If these are disconnected, or if these are using different frameworks, then the whole system can fall apart. So for example, if you are teaching something in your curriculum, but you are assessing something else in your test, these two won't line up. So whatever you're teaching, you're not testing, for example. Or let's say you have a new curriculum that you spend a lot of time developing. If you don't train teachers in the delivery side of things, then again, it's not going to be well delivered. All that work you've done on your curriculum is going to fall apart if you haven't trained up your teachers. So it's really important that these three aspects of learning are aligned. And one way to do that is to use a CEFR that provides a common standard, a common framework across all three aspects, ensures that everyone's on the same page, they're using the same language, they have the same aims, they're looking for the same outcomes. And the CEFR is one way to do that. Throughout the presentation today, I'm going to be talking about how we can actually do this in assessment. And I'll be using examples from our own test, English score. So just to give you a brief background of this, it's a global test and certificate of English for employment. We have over 2 million users using our test every year in 150 countries, so it's a global test. And we're partnering with universities, employers, and governments around the world to encourage them to use it, and for students and teachers, etc., to be taking this test. We have a range of different tests. So we have a core skills test, which is grammar, vocab, reading, and listening. We have a speaking test, which assesses skills like pronunciation, fluency, and communication. And very soon we will have a writing test. We're currently testing that, trialing that at the moment to make sure that it works as we would like it to, and that we can be confident in the results, and that will be coming very soon. Our test is mobile first, so you can take it through your phone, either Android or iOS. And the test is suitable for either general use or more workplace English, primarily aimed at graduating students as they enter employment, so students who are, or language learners who are 16 plus. And crucially, and the reason I'm talking today, is that it awards a CEFR level from A2 to C1. So if we go back to those levels, it's sort of awarding from, say, elementary up to advanced learners. You'll have a chance at the end of the presentation, we have a link so that you can actually take the test, experience the test, and get a certificate for the core skills test as well. And we'll have that link at the end of the presentation. So we're thinking specifically about assessment. We had those things, curriculum, delivery, and assessment. Let's talk specifically about assessment. Why align to the CEFR? What value does it bring? I think, first of all, it gives test takers, teachers, and other stakeholders a way to interpret test results using a common global framework. Every test reports scores slightly differently. For example, in English score, we report from 0 to 600. IELTS has a completely different scale. They report from 0 to 9. TOEIC will report on a different scale. Versant reports on a different scale. All these different tests are using their own different scales when it comes to reporting results. But if we use the CEFR, then we can all start to align to a common framework, and it gives test takers, it gives teachers it means they can understand the context of that score. So for example, in our English score test, we report both a number, but we also report on the CEFR. And that puts that 201 into the context of, okay, this person is A2, that means they are around elementary, and therefore I can put them into the right class, or I can hire them for this particular role that I'm looking for, or they can leave the university with a certain standard of English. As well as helping us understand the test results, because the CEFR is so comprehensive and so much research has been done into it, we can make these principled and valid comparisons between tests. So if you have two people with two different tests, you can actually start to compare the results and say, well, these are learners at the same level, or this one is slightly more advanced than the other. But again, it's a framework that's been used around the world, it's been developed by experts, and that means that any comparisons that you do make are principled and valid. And lastly, and I think this is probably where the focus of our time today will be, it's a way to ensure assessment quality. Again, a lot of work has been done on the CEFR. If we start to align our test to it, it's another measure of quality of your assessment. And that gives confidence to people taking our test, teachers and other people using our test, and also employers who may want to accept people based on the test results. I'd like to share an example of one of our valued partners here in Indonesia. This is the Wilden Isna, Head of Language Center at UNISKA Kediri. They're currently using English Score for their students. As you can see, they find real value in having an international certificate of English proficiency. And I've highlighted this section there around the value of the CEFR description. So as I say, for English Score, we report both the number, but we also align this. The test is really closely aligned with the CEFR, and that helps them with evaluating and monitoring the English proficiency of their students. I'll just give you a few seconds to read through that. Okay, so let's move on. So we'll move on to the sort of the key topic of today's presentation, which was around these 5 key steps of how do we, when we're building an assessment, when we're creating a new assessment, or even looking at an existing assessment, how can we align this to the CEFR? What's the value of that? We've seen, again, having that global standard really helps test takers and teachers and other stakeholders understand both what their test means, but also how does that relate to other tests, and it gives you a sense of quality and validation of your test. There are 5 key steps, and if I start at the top here, so we have familiarization, move on to specification, standardization, standard setting, and validation. And I'll talk more about these in more detail and what they look like and why they're important. I think the key thing to take away from this slide is that this is very much a cycle. So we typically start at familiarization and we move our way through these different stages, but it's an ongoing process. Things change. Our assessment may change. We will change our questions, but also our context changes. Who is using our assessment will change. Where it's being used, again, will change. So we need to ensure that we are constantly checking and reviewing and making sure that our test continues to be aligned to the CEFR. So this process is quite a long, intensive, resource-heavy process, but it is well worth doing, but it's also a very much an ongoing process. And I'll return to that at the end of my presentation. So if we start with the very first one, familiarization. And I like to think of this as this question also: what CEFR levels, skills, and activities are relevant to my context? And that's really important, that you have a good understanding of your context. So where are you using this assessment and why are you using it? And then you can use the CEFR to help you kind of refine that. So if we start very generically, and it's a good idea to start at a high level and ask yourself several questions about my context. So for example, what activities are relevant to me? And by activities, I mean, what are we talking about? Productive skills. So speaking and writing, are we talking about receptive skills, reading and listening? Is it a combination of those? It might be using all 4, but you're focused more on the speaking side of things. All of that will change depending on the context. So if we think about sort of workplace, employer-based English, it'd be a combination of probably all 4 skills, but you may find, depending on the role, that you're spending a lot more time writing than you are speaking. Another good question to ask yourself at this point is, what levels am I working with? Am I dealing with sort of A1, A2, beginner, elementary, or am I dealing with much more advanced learners at, say, C1 and C2? And again, you think about the context of my assessment. Do I want an assessment that covers the whole range of the CEFR? Do I want to focus on a particular part of the CEFR? Do I need 2, 3, or 4 different assessments for different levels of the CEFR? These are all things you should be asking yourself at this stage. And then last key question is, what domains are suitable? So we talked about domains in terms of personal, public, occupational, and academic or educational. Depending on the context that you're working in, depending on what people want to use your test for, that's another key question. So at English Score, we're very much focused on sort of the occupational domain, but at the lower levels, we also use the personal and public domains. Other tests will focus primarily on the academic or the educational domain. And again, that really depends on your context. There's no right or wrong answer. It's just important to understand how is my test going to be used, and what is the value that test is going to bring. Once you've asked yourselves those generic questions, you then move into the next stage, which is more specific. You're getting into deciding which descriptors. As I said, the CEFR is made up of a whole bank of different descriptors. These are all available, but you need to go through and decide, well, which ones are relevant. So based on the activities that I've decided are relevant to me, the levels and the domains I'm working in, I need to choose my descriptors. And here's an example of a descriptor, which you might think, yep, that looks great. That's relevant to my context. But then you need to kind of align everyone that on what these descriptors mean. So on the surface level, this descriptor looks good. I think this is relevant to my context. But we have things here like short narratives. We need to make sure that everyone is aligned and understands what is a short narrative. Is that 50 words, 100 words, 200 words? Again, there's no right or wrong answer. It's just important to ensure that everyone is aligned on that and has a shared understanding of what that means. Familiar situations. Really interesting question. What is familiar? Familiar to me might be very unfamiliar to you, and vice versa. So we need to make sure as part of this familiarization that we have a shared understanding of what familiar actually means. High frequency everyday language. Okay, now this feels like quite a low level. If we're talking about high frequency everyday language, we're probably talking about A1, A2. But again, what is everyday language? That will depend on the context. And high frequency, again, depends on the context. So it's really important that whatever is in the CEFR, that we just don't take that and use that without reviewing it and thinking, well, what does that mean for me? What does that mean for my context? A2 in one context may look quite different to A2 in a different context. But the key thing really for this stage is to understand the situation that you'll be using your assessment, get a detailed understanding of that, and then go through the CEFR and start to look at, well, what descriptors fit that context. Once you've decided that, and that, it's quite a short, well, I presented it in quite briefly, but it's quite a detailed stage. It requires quite a lot of research into your context and quite a lot of work with other people to make sure that you are aligned. But once you have done that, you then get into the kind of, I think, the most exciting part, which is, what does that mean for my assessment? How do I design my assessment to reflect that work that I've done and understanding my context? And I'm going to use the example of reading. I think I quite like looking at reading. I think there are lots of different things within reading that you can really unpack and talk about, particularly in this context. So we could talk about sort of reading skills. As you all know, you have local reading skills, which is reading very much at the word and sentence-based level, so reading for detail. But then you also have global reading, which is understanding the whole context of the text. This might be questions of sort of how does the writer feel about a particular topic, or what would be a good heading for this particular text. Okay. So it's good to think about, this is all particular to reading, but what am I doing? Am I doing local reading, reading for detail, or more global general reading? Expeditious versus careful. Expeditious, so am I doing fast reading? We typically talk about this as teachers as sort of skimming and scanning. We're always telling our students to skim and scan for certain words in reading. That would be an example of expeditious reading. Or am I doing very careful reading? And that'd be reading for detail and understanding the finer detail, the finer nuance between different viewpoints in a text, for example. with an English score, we want to make sure that we are covering all these reading skills. Okay, so we want to be testing both local and global reading, expeditious, and also careful reading. The domains. So for English score, we have focused primarily on the occupational domain, but as I say, at the lower levels, where perhaps our test takers don't have the language to work so well in occupational domain, we also bring in some personal and public domains as well. And then we have our CEFR descriptors. You know, as mentioned, there are a whole range of different descriptors in the CEFR. Here are some of the ones that we have selected for English score. So we're looking at overall reading comprehension. We've decided, well, let's use the descriptors that talk about reading instructions. So there's a whole set of descriptors that talk about what people can do or how they read instructions at different levels. Reading instructions feels like a really good sort of occupational domain descriptor. This is something that our test takers will need to be doing in the workplace. That might be instructions about how to operate machinery. It might be instructions about how to structure a report. That feels like a good reading skill that we should be testing. Reading correspondence, again, super relevant to the occupational domain. They'll be dealing with emails, chat messages, interacting with different people through writing. That feels like a good kind of descriptor that we should be including in our test. And reading for pleasure, perhaps less relevant to occupational, but really relevant in the personal and public domains. And the pleasure could be books, it could be newspapers, magazine articles, it could be things that you find online. But again, we wanted to include that in our test. So once you've decided these, you can then start to think about, well, what does this look like in practice in my test? How do I design my questions to reflect all these things that I want to do, that I want to include based on what I know about my context? And we're going to look at some examples of what we've done in English score. So you'll see a couple of reading questions here. Let's look at the first one. This is what we call our gap fill reading type. So you can see you've got some text here at the top, and then they have 3 question options to choose from, and they have to choose the right option to complete the text. So as I say, we call this our gap fill item. We think this covers local careful reading. Okay, so they're having to read sort of, well, they're having to read quite carefully up until this point. He, so that tells me, all right, so there's got to be a verb coming, enjoys, brings, takes. I need to be reading quite carefully to make sure I choose the correct response. We're not asking them to say, to look at the whole text and come up with a summary of it or anything like that, which would be more the local. The global will be more focused on the local understanding, reading each word, reading each sentence, and making sure we understand it. In terms of level, I don't know if you have any thoughts, but my feeling is, well, sorry, in terms of domain, this is very much a personal domain, right? So we said personal is sort of your everyday life. This is about John going to the market, what he likes to buy, what he likes to do with the food that he buys. And as mentioned, the level is sort of quite low at A2. So this is around your elementary, possibly pre-intermediate level. And then in terms of descriptor, what does this look like in terms of the CEFR descriptor? I think this is a good match. You know, so this text comes from the CEFR, can understand text describing people, places, everyday life and culture. That feels like a good fit for this question, and it's using simple language. Again, I think that's about right for this item. So in this way, we can start to build links between our question items, sorry, our test items, and the CEFR descriptors. And this is another piece that you'll need to do as you start to align your test. If we look at another one, drag and drop. So in this case, we have the starting sentence, and then students need to arrange the 3 following sentences in the right order. So you can drag and drop these 3 sentences here to make sure that the text is complete and coherent. Now, this is slightly different to the first one. We're looking for local reading. You need to read each sentence carefully, make sure you understand that, but you also need to do some global reading. You need to make sure that the whole thing works together as the text. So these 2 sentences may follow together, but does that follow with the whole text? Doesn't make sense. So here we're testing both local and global reading, and we're also testing that quite careful reading as well. In terms of domain, This feels a little bit more public. This is not about what I like to do, what someone I know likes to do. This is more general information. So this is more of a public domain. It's not work-based and it's not educational. So it's definitely in that public area. In terms of level, I think both the language in this test item is a bit higher than the one we saw previously, but also it's longer, which then becomes much more difficult for that test taker. So we would say this is around B1. In terms of, so if I think it's B1, I can go back to the CFR and say, well, what descriptor is relevant? And I think this is the best descriptor you're going to find for this item. Can understand the main points in descriptive notes, museum exhibits, explanatory boards. This feels like something I might see in a museum, possibly talking about a teddy bear that you might see in a museum, for example. And again, that's building the link between my test items and the descriptors in the CEFR. Here's a couple more, just to show you how this looks like in practice. So we have this item here, which is the gap fill title. Students are given a longer text. This text goes down to probably around here. It's around 100, 150 words long. And they need to choose the best title for the text. Okay, so we're not really asking them about the detail of the text. We're asking them what's the best title, what's the best summary of this text. So if we think about the skills in this one, it's really global. We're asking them to summarize this text. So global versus local. Expeditious, in that they will need to read that quite quickly to get a rough idea of what the text is talking about. But then they need to go also into more careful reading detail to select the right option. So you can again see that these reading skills, they're not exclusive. You'll be doing a range of these different reading skills as you attempt different items. Again, this is I think public. This feels like a news article, something that you might read in a magazine or a newspaper or online. And again, we're moving up those levels. So this is B2. So this is moving into the upper intermediate. You can see that the text is much longer. The vocabulary level is much higher. And that's why we're moving up the CFR level. But again, having that CFR level descriptor gives us, aligns us all. We can all say, well, this is B2. And this is the descriptor that I think it most closely matches, I think here, content and relevance of news items on a range of topics. I think that's a good descriptor. And again, that starts to build that alignment between the item and the CFR. Lastly, we'll look at triple long reading, which is a much longer text. It's sort of 250 words. So it comes down to about here on the page. And we're asking the question of what is the author's overall viewpoint? I love these types of questions. Because there will be no one word, there'll be no one sentence that you can point to and say that's the answer. You have to understand the whole text. You have to understand how does the writer feel about it? What language are they using to demonstrate their feelings and their opinion? So there's both global reading, but also careful reading. You need to get a sense of how do they feel, but also you need to look for the details within the text. This is definitely occupational. So we're moving from the personal, the public, to the occupational domain. And here we've got challenges in management, business executives. This is definitely workplace English. And this is much, much harder. So with C1, we're moving into more of the advanced learner area. In terms of descriptor, professional, finer points of detail, including attitudes and implied as well as stated opinions. And that feels like a really good fit here. So our question was, what are the author's overall viewpoint? And we're asking, we've got here around implied as well as stated opinions. This is an example of how you start to connect your item types to the CEFR. And if you've got an existing test, you can do this, but also if you're developing a new test, as we were at English Score, you can do this from the very beginning. When you're writing your items, you start to building those links. You're starting to look at what does the CEFR say? What does the CEFR recommend? How can I use that when I build my items? That was our second stage. If we move into our third stage, which is standardization. And I think this is the question of how do I know what level the questions are at? I have said previously, this is a B2, this is a B1, but how do we know that? How can we be confident in that? It's not enough just for me to say that. We need to have confidence that everyone agrees on that. And we need some kind of reference, we need some kind of review process to ensure that is happening consistently and accurately. There are a few different things we can do around that. And I've talked through a few things that we do at English Score to ensure that. One is our item writers. It's really important that the people writing the questions, writing the items in your test, have experience in using the CEFR. Now that experience could be through working in assessment, but also teaching. Teaching experience is hugely important, understanding the challenges that students have, what different levels look like in different contexts. I think that's the second thing here, is understanding the context. If we go back to our first stage, familiarization, it's really important that the people writing the test have a really good understanding of the context as well, because that's going to be important in how they write the items and how they link to the CFR. Now, your question writers might have all that experience, they might know the context really well, they still need to be trained and aligned on the CFR. The CEFR has a great set of descriptors, but we still need to make sure that we all agree on what they actually mean. So as part of that training and alignment with your writers at English Score, we review the CEFR descriptors. We make sure that we understand them. If we go back to my earlier slide of, we had that example of a short narrative. What is short? What does that look like in practice? Another really interesting activity, I think, is self-assessment. So if you speak another language apart from your own mother tongue or L1, is to kind of self-assess your own language using the CEFR. And that's a really good way to get familiar with the descriptors. I don't have huge language skills, but for example, with French, I could go and look at descriptors and I might rate myself as sort of a B1 speaker of French, for example. And that's a really nice way to put yourselves in the shoes of the learners and understand what you can and can't do at the different levels. And another key piece of the training and alignment process is to review existing materials and say, well, what level did we assign to that? Why did we assign that level of A2 or B1 or whatever it might be? And you use that to check as understanding amongst your item writers. So that's one way that you can kind of ensure the quality and the standardization when it comes to aligning the CFR. Thankfully, that's not the only thing we do. There are also a huge number of tools online that you can use this to align with the CFR. The ones that we commonly use at English Score are English vocabulary profile, English grammar profile. And again, if you look online, you'll find these. This represents a huge amount of work done after the CFR was first established to align English vocabulary to the CFR. So you can look up any individual word and see what level it is on the CFR. So whether it's A2, B1, etc. And the same with grammar. So for example, you can look up comparatives and that might tell you, well, that's typically taught at A2 and therefore you can teach it. You can test it in an A2 test, for example. Whereas if you look at passives, that starts at A2, but it starts to move into B1 and even B2 with the more advanced forms of passive tenses. So really useful tools to be looking at specific words. In the context of reading, we have a tool which again is available online called Text Inspector. Really interesting, super powerful tool. And again, it's available online if people do want to use it. I'll show you an example of what that looks like. So I have this text. Let's say this is a reading text that I would like to use in my test. This feels like probably an occupational type text. So thinking about those domains, personal, public, occupational, educational, this feels like probably occupational. But as an item writer or as a test, as an assessment manager, I want to know, well, what level is this? I mean, I think it's a certain level, maybe another item writer agrees with me or they disagree. Is there a tool that we can use to help us make that decision? So if we put it into Text Inspector, we get a whole range of reporting, but this is probably a nice, clear snapshot of the kind of reporting you get back. Text Inspector looks at that text and says, well, most of the words in this text are A1. Around 60% of the words are at A1, okay? So beginner. About 30% of the words are A2, and not many, probably 4 or 5% of the words are at B2, and a few it doesn't quite know, doesn't recognize them. So it gives you this report, and that gives me quite a lot of useful information. I think, well, actually, it's not surprising that we've got a large number of A1 words, given that, things like is and she and have and so on are going to be A1. But A2, that looks like, that's quite interesting. My feeling is sort of colleagues, busy, moment, possibly later. These feel like A2 words. So I think I could use this text in an A2 item. And I think this is another way to build that link and kind of validate what you think. I think the key thing with Text Inspector is not to rely on it so much that it overrules all your experience, all your expertise that you might have in your item writers, or all that work that you've spent looking at the descriptors. It's another tool that you can use. It's another, another resource that you can rely on. If we look at a much longer text, so again, you think, well, this is clearly going to be higher than A2, but how much higher? Is this a B2, C1, C2? Can I get a sense of that? So again, if you put that into Text Inspector, you get a report like this. Again, understandably, a lot of words are A1, given that you've got a lot of useful, fairly simple words, it is, and so on. But you can see you've got words at A2, B1, B2, and even C1 and C2. So this is a much higher level of text. It's obviously longer. As an item writer, you'd be looking at this, you'd be using your own expertise, you'd be working with other item writers, and you would probably place this in around B2. So again, a really useful tool to help you make these decisions. But as I say, I think it's just one tool, and you need this whole range of different tools and expertise to make these decisions. One last thing that you can do as part of your standardization, as part of your ensuring that what you decide for an item, if you decide an item is A2 or B1, is part of your review process. So this is how we develop items at English School, and I'll walk you through it. So we start by having an item writer, experienced item writer, write the item, and they will assign a CEFR level when they do that. So say, I've written this item, I think it is A2. It then goes into peer review. So other item writers will review that item. Two other item writers will review that, and they will give comments back to the item writer, say, yeah, I agree with you, I think this is A2, or no, actually, I think this is more of a B1 based on my experience, based on my understanding of the context, and here's why. And the item writer then takes that feedback. So you've got two other people looking at that item and giving them feedback. It then goes into what we call discuss, yes or no. If the item writer is happy with it, if the two peer reviewers agree with it and they think, yes, we agree with what the item writer has written, we agree that this is an A2 item, it can go through and it goes into our next stage of item development. However, I would say 20 to 30% of the time, people don't agree. And that's absolutely fine. Everyone has different experience. Everyone is using slightly different understandings of the context, and we need to discuss it further. So we'll go into what we call panel review. And this is where the whole item writing team, supported by myself, such as the assessment manager, will look at these items, and we have a discussion. We may spend half a day, a whole day looking at items and reviewing them and trying to understand, well, what level is this item? How does that align to the CFR? And as a result of that panel review, we may say, fine, we accept it. It is A2 and it can go through. We may say, well, it needs a bit more work. It needs to be changed. It's too easy. It's not suitable for A2. We need to make it more difficult. And the item writer will make the changes, and then it will come back into review, and we'll review those changes, and then we will sign it off or not. We may say, this is not going to work. This item cannot work at this level. Now that may be because of the language and we can't change the language. It may be because of sensitivity issues that may not work in the particular context that we're talking about. If we go back to the very early stages, we talked about how important it is to understand your context and make sure that your test items reflect that context. So it may go into the reject pile, and we may say, well, we can't use that item. That's done. But again, this whole review process is really important as part of your standardization, that we all agree and align on what that means, what the CFR level means, and how we can actually ensure the quality of our items all the way through the process. Our fourth stage is standard setting. And this is quite different to the other ones, I think. This involves numbers, lots and lots of numbers, lots and lots of statistics. It's quite a lengthy, involved stage, requires quite a lot of time and effort to implement, but really valuable in terms of aligning your test to the CEFR. Essentially, it's how do I report test results in the CEFR? So we give you a score. We saw at the beginning that English score reports, for example, from 0 to 600. But how do we convert that score of 0 to 600 to a CEFR scale, A1, A2, B1, etc.? And to do that, we use standard setting. And you might have different contexts. Some tests are, for example, we have a B1 test. And you either pass or fail that B1 test. And if you pass it, great, you are certified as B1. If you fail it, you are not certified, you're probably A2, even A1. Right? But how do we decide what is that pass-fail boundary? How do we know that someone who scores 58 is a pass and someone who scores 57 is a fail? And therefore the one at 58 is B1 and the one at 57 is A2. How do we know that? The alternative might be, as we do an English score, we give you a score, 0 to 600, but we also give you an equivalent CEFR scale. So you can CEFR score. So you can see on the right-hand side, if you get to 200, you are A2. If you get to 300, you are B1. And the final result for our score, our test taker was 372. And we can say, well, you are B1. But again, how do we know that? How can we be confident in that? How can we demonstrate that? And that's where standard setting comes in. It helps us decide those boundaries. What's the difference between A2 and B1? What's the difference between B1 and B2? And what does that mean for our scoring? There are a whole range of different ways of doing this. I'm going to show you one that we've done at English Score, which is called the bookmark method. If you're interested in that, we have a report on our website that goes into the detail of how we actually do this. And most exam boards, most exam companies will do this kind of linking or standard setting activity, but really important for translating your test scores into your CEFR. I'm going to walk you through what we've done at English Score, which is the bookmark method. This is a very brief overview, but it'll give you a sense of the kinds of things that we're doing. The first thing we do is we analyze questions to decide their difficulty. So there's a range of different sort of statistical tools that you can use to work out how difficult are my items. And you do that using real test data or real test taker information. So you can trial your items, you get information back from people who have attempted the questions, and you can say, well, that's a really easy question, that's a really difficult question, and we can put a number on that. We can say, well, the easy ones are kind of at the lower end of the scale, and the hard ones are at the higher end of the scale. So that's the first step for this method. Secondly, we then create what we call a book of questions in order of difficulty. So we create perhaps 30 or 40 different questions from easy to difficult. And then we align our subject matter experts, so our SMEs. So these are people who are experienced in the CEFR, experienced in this method. We do an alignment session, make sure everyone has a shared understanding of the CEFR. And then we give them that book. And we ask them to place a bookmark where the CEFR level changes. So I'll show you what that looks like. We've got these 4 items. This is a smaller scale. Normally it would be sort of 30, 40, 50 items. This is our really easy question. This question's slightly more difficult again, and even more difficult, okay? So you can see that the difficulty number is going up. And my question to the experts would be, some of these are A2, some of these are probably B1. Where's the boundary? Where does it stop being A2 and where does it start being B1? And so each expert would go through and say, well, based on my understanding of the CEFR, based on my experience, based on my understanding of the context, they might say, well, I think the boundary is here. And I think these 3 questions are at the CEFR A2 level, and this one is at the CEFR B1 level. Now, that is one person's judgment based on their understanding of the context, on their understanding of the CEFR, and the work that we've done to align them. But they are an expert. Great. So we take their response. That's our first person. They said, well, let's put the boundary here between blue and red. We ask another expert and they said, well, I think it's here. I think it's slightly easier, 47,449. And we ask another one, well, I agree with that person. I think it's here. This one, no, you're all wrong. I think it's up here. And you keep asking. You can ask 8, 10, 12 different experts. They're all going to give you slightly different answers. And that's fine. We all have different understandings. So then what we do is we say, well, this is what you all thought. You don't agree with each other. Fine, absolutely fine. No issues with that. But here's what you all thought. And then they present what they think and they challenge each other. Well, I think you're wrong. I think it should be here. No, you're wrong. I think it should be here. And there's a lot of back and forth. And that can take half a day, a whole day of discussion around working out, aligning each other on the CEFR, because that's really important. Things change and we all have different understandings of the context and so on. Once you've done that discussion, you then say, okay, let's do it again. You understand what each other thinks? Let's do it again. And this is the second time we do it. And you can see they've come much, much closer together, right? So we're all in the same area right now. We've asked the same 8 people, the same activity, and they've come much closer together. And again, you may say, well, that's not close enough for me. I want you all to agree. And so we have another round of discussion and we challenge each other. We say, well, why did you put the boundary there and not in this place? And you repeat that process again. And you can repeat the process 2, 3, 4 times until you get to the point where you are confident in your results. The key thing here is that you are sharing that, you're discussing that, and you're starting to align and you start to set these boundaries. And the takeaway here is that, this black line here is the boundary based on expert opinion between A2 and B1. And we can use that information to now convert our test score into our CEFR. That's a very brief overview of what the bookmark method looks like. And there are different ways of doing this, but essentially it comes down to asking experts for their opinions based on the CEFR, discussing that, challenging that, and eventually arriving at consensus. And you can use that consensus to report. As I say, we have a report on our website, how we've done this for English Score. If you're interested in that, it's available online. And there are lots of other methods out there. But it's a really intensive process. It's a really long, kind of resource-heavy process. But it is really, really interesting. And you very often, all the time, you eventually arrive at this consensus. And it's nice to see experts sort of challenging and aligning and gradually coming to that point. Looking at the time, so I am going to speed up a little bit. We've got our last stage, which is validation. Nice short stage. Well, I say short. It's short to talk about, it's quite involved to actually do. This is how do I demonstrate that my test is aligned with the CEFR? I've done all this work. I've done my standard setting, my standardization. How do I demonstrate that? You need to gather all the evidence you have. So that might be the results from your standard setting. That might be all the research you've done into your context. It could be feedback from the participants. You've seen we've evolved experts and item writers and people using the test. I need to gather all that feedback. You may want someone externally, completely externally from your company or from your organization or from your university to review everything you've done. You have to gather all that evidence. You have to document it, present the argument, and also highlight the limitations. So essentially, validation is about sort of demonstrating all the work that you've done in these previous 4 stages. To show the links between your test and the CEFR. And then once you've done that and presented that and written that up, you need to go, as I said at the very beginning, you need to commit to that ongoing monitoring and review. If I come back to my 5 steps, I said at the very beginning, this is a cycle. We've moved through these. You would have spent months, possibly years doing all these things. You get to the validation and yes, it starts all over again. Things change. So your context might change. The people that are taking the test might change. Your test design might change. So you need to continually repeat this process, continually improving the way that your test aligns to the CEFR. So that's the end. That's those 5 steps. As I say, really important to follow those 5 steps if you do want to align to the CEFR. The benefit of that is that it is a global respected framework for talking about language proficiency. And if you can align your test or align your curriculum to the CEFR, it gives you that sense of, well, it's a measure of the quality and the validity of the materials that you've been working on. But also means that people understand what your test score means around the world. It is a global framework and it's really useful in that context. If you would like to try the English Score core skills test, there is a link here that you can use. You will get a certificate after you've completed the test, and you'll also receive a certificate of attendance for the webinar. So I will end there and would like to open the floor to questions.
All right. Thank you very much, Pak Ben, for the wonderful and outstanding presentation. For sure, this is a very beneficial insight for us who is going to develop our own test and, of course, to reevaluate our already established test, right? Okay, before we move to the question and answer session, first of all, this is a standard question from Indonesian participants, of course. Will the slide materials available post-conference? Just kidding. But surely, if it is available, it will be very beneficial for us, Pak Ben. All right, for the first section, we would like to invite three participants to deliver their question. But first, if you like to ask a question, please raise your virtual hand and then we will call you for your question. And then please identify yourself and the presenter to the presenter and to whom you would like to ask the question. And then for the other two, that you can also put your question in the chat feature. Yeah, we have one appendix here. Who Adrian? Yes, please.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity, moderator Pak Ahdi. My name is Andriani Marentek, and I'm from UPT Bahasa Universitas Samratulangi, Mr. Benko. Nice to meet you. But our institution is also one of the FILMA members. So thank you very much for all of the explanation and knowledge that you have just shared. They're really very precious to especially me and all of us here, I'm sure. But there are several questions that I'd like to ask Mr. Cook in this case. If you don't mind, probably 2 or 3 questions here. I hope it's all right. So dealing with the CEFR. So we already know that many institutions around the globe has used the CEFR as a point of reference, in many curriculum as well as a language assessment particularly. It's like a bit of a panacea, maybe a panacea for probably language assessment problem, and probably it is accepted as a given that it has to be followed, maybe. So, however, as the name indicates, it is a common quote-unquote European framework of reference. So, my question is, the first one is, are there possibilities of cultural bias in this case in implementing the quote-unquote European framework of reference in the curriculum and assessment in, for example, in our country, Indonesia? I know also that Malaysia uses CFR in their language assessment field of study. In this case, there are studies dealing with that as well, if I'm not mistaken. Last time when I went to a conference in Malang, if I'm not mistaken, you were also there, Mr. Cook. And there are some presentations dealing with it. But I was just wondering if you also know studies dealing with the CFR, whether or not the implementation of CFR in countries like Indonesia, ASEAN countries, for example, really appropriate for our local setting in this case, or probably other are there any other findings maybe that contradictive to our perception of the CEFR framework? So that's my question, sir. And then the second one is dealing with the method that you have just explained when dealing with the items of tasks, the bookmark method, if I'm not mistaken. I was just wondering, there is a particular point there, number 3, which is align subject matters with the experts. The experts here, could you please explain, sir? Who are the experts that we need to, for example, contact with in order to really make sure that the subject matters of our, for example, test items are really suitable or meet the requirements of CFR? So those are my questions, sir. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Bu Adrian. Pak Pen, are you going to answer first, or we move to the next attendee first? Yeah, are you going to answer first?
Yes. Yeah, no, great.
Yes,
I'd be
okay.
very happy to answer those two questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, really interesting questions. I think the question around cultural bias, you know, I think it's really relevant, really important, and I think it's becoming increasingly, or there's increasing awareness around this topic in English assessment. I think there are two things I'd say about that. One, I think the CEFR is, I think, aware of this, and they do update their descriptors. And I think going forward, they will continue to do that. So they most recently published a companion volume in 2020, which I think started to address some of these concerns. And I'm sure that there is ongoing work to kind of continue to look at that. I think, like you say, as it becomes used more and more around the world, that there are going to be more and more of these questions. I think not just in language assessment and CFR, but generally in English teaching around the world, there's just much more awareness of that. So I think that's one part. I would say, I think, you know, if you go back to the very beginning of these steps, we talked about familiarization and the importance of understanding context. I think, you know, if you're dealing in, say, for example, in Indonesia, the people that will be doing that familiarization are really, really familiar with the context. And as that group, you can decide what you want to take from that CFR. The CFR has a whole range of different descriptors. You can choose which ones you want to use that are relevant for your context. So if you feel that certain sets of descriptors are not appropriate, they don't fit into that culture that you're working in, or the use case for your assessment, you do not have to use them. And that's why I think it's really important to do that first stage so thoroughly, and, you know, move from that generic kind of thinking about where am I using this to the more specific of what descriptors actually mean something to me and my test takers and my learning environment, my context. And I think that's one way to address that potential cultural bias. So I think it's kind of having both of those. It's the CEFR as an organization is aware of that and will try and address it, but also, you know, you can tailor it and you can adjust it according to your context. I think having the right people to do that as well. So, you know, having the right experts who understand that context, who are aware of some of the cultural sensitivities of working in a particular context, is so important at the very early stages of this whole process. I think the second question around the bookmark method. Yes, great question. And I kind of skipped over that in my rush to finish, but I think the subject matter experts should, again, it's really the same point around, they should understand the CEFR, they should be familiar with the CEFR descriptors, but they also, again, need to understand the context. I think I said at the beginning, you know, someone A2 in one country, in one context, may be quite different to an A2 in a different context or a different country. So your experts should be familiar with the CEFR and the context. Whether they're familiar with the method or not is not really so important, because we can train them to use the method, but you do need a really good facilitator for your training for that, who is familiar with the method themselves. But it's more about those experts being, having the expertise in the CEFR and the language levels, because like you saw in that process, it is a judgment and it's their judgment. And although we look at that judgment across a whole range of experts, it's important that they do understand that. So I think in terms of who your expert should be, it's familiarity with the CEFR and a familiarity with the context that you're working in.